Like many who heard John the Baptist preaching, Jesus, the starving Galilean peasant village artisan and day laborer, was moved to submit to his baptism. All gospel writers were embarrassed about this. They never would have invented Jesus, the Messiah, submitting to John the Baptist. Scholars believe that the evangelists have downplayed an important historical reality related to this baptism. The historical Jesus also became a disciple of John the Baptist, and until John was imprisoned and put to death, for some time, the historical Jesus himself followed him, obeyed him, and administered John's baptism to others like a good disciple following his superior and master. Why would the historical Jesus seek out baptism from John the Baptist and follow his faction? Probably because he was moved to repentance by John's preaching. Perhaps his manual laborer was sometimes less than perfect. Maybe accidentally or unintentionally, Jesus cheated a customer. Remember what John announced: forgiveness of sins for Israelites. And that's why an Israelite would go to John, folks. Even, as in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, it meant shamefully leaving family and village. That word we translate as forgive was magical to Galilean peasants and landless artisans like Jesus. It meant canceling debts. Folks, starving Galilean peasants were crushed by debt. The entire life of a peasant revolved around honor, and that demanded the canceling of debt. So it's quite plausible that the historical Jesus, as an artisan, desperately needed forgiveness of debts. Simultaneously, John's baptism inserted candidates into a transformed Israelite community, which John announced. Meeting John the Baptist in a wilderness setting at the Jordan meant Jesus had to leave his village and family behind. In other words, he had to die to his old group self and become a new group self. And I say group self because that's the only kind of self there is in the Mediterranean cultural world of the Bible, populated by nothing but collectivists with zero individualists. Self means group self in the Bible. This is Jesus' first symbolic step out of his kinship network on the way to establishing a new surrogate kinship network, the Jesus Movement. In the reports of Mark, Matthew, and Luke about Jesus' baptism, the testimony of the voice from the sky vault is very important. Jesus is identified as my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Now think about what such an experience would have meant for Jesus, a peasant nothing person who all his life had been mocked as if he were illegitimate, as if he were a bastard. The ancient Mediterranean world believed that the male deposited a fully formed miniature adult, called a seed, into the female, viewed simply as a field for the seed. Folks like N.T. Wright don't know what they're talking about when they assert that ancient people knew where babies came from. Not yet having achieved the contemporary understanding of human reproduction, and lacking the sophisticated paternity tests of our modern era, these ancient people were totally unable to prove paternity at the biological level. Want to see their way of testing paternity? Read Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31. Because of all this, the public and social acknowledgement of paternity by the male was of critical importance. This act not only gave the child legitimacy and appropriate social standing in the community, but also publicly obliged the father to accept responsibility for the child. In Luke's version of Jesus' baptism, the voice from Sky Vault acknowledges Jesus as my Son, my Beloved, with whom I am well pleased. What kind of human experience was this in which Jesus hears a voice from the sky speaking to him? Scholars note that it is an experience in an alternate state of consciousness, or an experience of alternate reality. On average, 90% of the world's cultures today regularly and routinely have such experiences. and find them useful and meaningful in their cultural context. Only the industrialized West has managed to block this pan-human potential. Now, there are some scholars who would insist that the baptism of Jesus is an interpretation from the evangelist pen. In other words, the evangelist named Mark made this story up. Okay, let's say we say they're right. Well, we'd still have to admit that the anonymous author built wisely on the culture and made the point with very persuasive cultural plausibility. The transfiguration of Jesus and the appearances of the risen Jesus also belong to this category of human experience, alternate states of consciousness. The baptism of Jesus is his formal calling and initiation as a holy man, what anthropologists call a shaman. Cross-cultural studies identify 6 steps in this process. The first step is that the candidate makes contact with the spirit and spirit world. The second step is the spirit identifies itself. Here, the sky is torn open and wind, or the spirit, descends upon Jesus. In the Bible, wind or spirit designates God's activity. In Mark chapter 1, verse 8, the activity of God is judgment, separating people. In verse 11, God's activity is Father. And Jesus demonstrates his ability to deal successfully with a malicious spirit without being harmed. That's the third step, folks. The fourth step is where the holy man becomes an apprentice to both a spirit teacher and a human teacher. Scholars tell us that Jesus initially was, for some time, a disciple of John the Baptist, even baptizing other Israelites with the baptism of John. No doubt, from John the Baptist, Jesus also learned the basic skills of a shaman, a holy man, who was an experienced, successful, and, to judge by the crowds he attracted, highly respected Israelite shaman. 5. Once initiated, the holy man becomes increasingly familiar with the possessing spirit and the spirit world. This is certainly evident in the transfiguration of Jesus, in which Jesus is again acknowledged by God as my beloved Son. And the disciples' witnesses are instructed to listen to him, more so than to Moses and Elijah. Finally, the holy man continues to have other experiences similar to the call and initiation experience, which can be technically described as a real experience in an alternate state of consciousness. Because God and the spirit world are involved in this experience, anthropologists call it a religious trance. Again, in the life of Jesus, these religious trances would include the testing of Jesus, wrongly called the temptation story, Jesus walking on the sea, that's a religious trance also, the transfiguration of Jesus, and for his followers, all experiences of the risen Jesus are also instances of religious trance. My friends, modern-day theological interpretations of baptism as a rite of initiation in the church often overshadow the basic cultural reality from which the rite evolved. A fresh look at the baptism of Jesus in its cultural context helps us appreciate the richness of our tradition.